Колеги, будемо продовжувати наш робочий день в українському кризовому.
We continue our work at the UCMC. May I welcome all the journalists who are present here and those who watch us in the online transmission. It's my pleasure to give the floor to Radosław Sikorski, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Poland, Marshal of the Sejm of Poland. He's going to share his impressions regarding those events which took place after the Revolution of Dignity 2 years ago, and his impressions of Ukraine and the prospects for this country. You have the floor.
I'm delighted to be here. Last time I was in this building in the beginning of the 1990s, this was the Lenin Museum, one of the most bloodthirsty tyrants that this globe has ever seen. So it's a fitting and a nice irony that this is now the seat, the center for Ukraine's free media. And the fact that Ukraine still has free media, in fact, they seem to be freer than ever, is important because it makes you different from some of the other countries in the former, that have been created on the in the former Soviet sphere. In particular, of course, the country which has thrown the gauntlet to Ukraine's revolution of dignity, I mean the Russian Federation. You see, the wonderful thing about no longer being in government is that one can speak plainly and call a spade a spade. Ukraine today is a free country. Russia today is an increasingly authoritarian country. And that is in itself a huge gain of the Ukrainian people, because it is that makes other changes and other gains possible. The Ukrainian people have now made their views plain in a dramatic fashion at least 3 times in the last quarter century. First, when they opted for independence, even before the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Second time in the Orange Revolution, and the third time with the Maidan. The first 2 attempts, the first one established the state. The second one was meant to make it more European, but disappointed. And you must not fail now. You must not disappoint, on the one hand, the Ukrainian people, but on the other hand, Europe, which has invested a lot of goodwill, but also a lot of assistance, both political and financial, in your success. And of course, I'm not here to comment on your internal politics. You have to be the judges of that. But what I can say is that 2 years ago, when I arrived here in Kiev and brought with me Frank-Walter Steinmeier and Laurent Fabius, the foreign ministers of Germany and France, Kiev was a city in revolt. And literally on the day that my colleagues arrived, up to 100 people were murdered on the Maidan by state-organized action. And today you can, it's actually hard to cross Krещатик from one end to the other, because the traffic is rather dense, which means that this is a city that is alive, and more than that, it's a city that has just re-elected its mayor. I have just seen Mayor Klitschko, and I am impressed, because as a politician I know how difficult it is to maintain the trust of your citizens in the midst of a crisis. And Ukraine is undoubtedly still in the midst of a crisis. Which must mean that Mayor Klitschko, for one, is still inspiring hope and trust. And this is hope and trust that must not be let down. when we were carrying out our fundamental reforms in the early 1990s, I was one of those people who said, not enough, not quickly enough. I was a very impatient 20-something-year-old. Today, I have to admit that the Balcerowicz reforms of the early 1990s, the 13 laws which, on one day, launched Poland from communism to the free market economy, was a record of speed and of efficiency. And they meant that Poland's post-communist recession was shallowest and shortest in the post-communist world. So I understand impatience, but I also would like to give credit where credit is due, namely that your government, this current government, has at last done what all the previous governments promised, including promised to me personally, that they would carry out the reform of the energy sector. And the energy sector was the source of monumental waste of resources, but also of heroic corruption that brought to Ukraine where she is today, or actually where she was 2 years ago. So I would like to salute Prime Minister Yatsenyuk, who I know knew the political effect of these reforms on his personal and on his political party's popularity ratings. It is never popular to bring reform that is absolutely necessary, that is the result of malfeasance by others, but you always get punished for doing the right thing. Ukraine has also succeeded in negotiating a fair deal with her commercial creditors, and having just come back from New York, I can tell you, having spoken to the financiers there, that Ukraine's financial standing is now good. They think Ukraine is a country that plays by the rules. Thirdly, I think it is crucial and good that Ukraine has started the process of decentralization. I can only tell you what has worked in Poland. And in Poland, the fact that cities, municipalities, local authorities have their own sources of taxation and get a slice of the corporation tax from companies that operate in the area, has produced a lively self-government culture and has now resulted in Polish cities being thriving and actually being quite rich. My hometown, a city called Bydgoszcz, has the same budget as the ministry that I used to run, the foreign ministry. And it's a city of just under 400,000. And the mayor of the town is the real manager of the city. It's the cities themselves that decide about important aspects of expenditure. And let me start concluding by saying that I believe the next 2 years are going to be crucial for Ukraine. There is not much you can do about the frozen conflict in the east. We now know that the key to switching this conflict on and off lies where it has always lain, which is to say with Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin. He can send weapons in, pay more mercenaries, send more troops in, or, as happened in September and October, he can switch the conflict off to almost nothing. So I hope that President Putin has appreciated that this is not a way to go, that he wants to lift the sanctions that unfortunately had to be imposed on Russia. And I hope he fulfills the Minsk agreement, in which I find one particularly important because a verifiable condition, namely the promise in Minsk to restore the control of the international border between Ukraine and Russia to Ukrainian authorities by the end of this year. That is, to my mind, a test of President Putin's goodwill and veracity in implementing the Minsk agreement. And if it's not done, then of course the sanctions should continue. But you've just had your local elections. I understand you have no major elections for the next 2 years. This is the time to speed up rather than slow down reforms. From everyone I talk to, starting with President Poroshenko, through the Prime Minister, through Mayor Klitschko, Ukrainian and foreign businessmen operating here, ordinary Ukrainians I meet, the number one priority seems to be fighting corruption. You need to restore your citizens' faith in the system and also Europe's faith in your ability to handle funds, to create the kind of state system which will make you compatible with future membership in the European Union. You have an action plan. The action plan has two parts. On the financial side, it's called the adjustment program by the International Monetary Fund. And it's a huge achievement that you are now, I understand, in compliance with IMF. And the other part of the plan, harder, bigger, is the association agreement with the EU, which gives you the freedom, with our help, to implement the acquis communautaire of Europe in your Ukrainian legal codes. In other words, to move Ukraine from the legal civilization of Sovietism and post-Sovietism to Europe, and to make Ukraine prepare for, I understand, your aspiration, which is one day to apply to the European Union. And if you do these things, Europe has promised you in the association agreement, or rather in one of the political statements around the association agreements, what Poland never had when we had our association agreement, which is the statement that the association agreement is not the last stage in your relationship with the EU. That's as much as you'll get at this stage, but it's an encouragement to do on your part what's necessary. First, to get visa-free regime, and then association agreement, and then to be on the path to membership. President Putin is now declaring that he will show us in the West how to sort out the Middle East. I think that's an ambition which should be encouraged. We need help in the Middle East. I don't think the aerial campaign in Syria will do it. I think Russia, to achieve that aim, would need to carry out a serious ground operation. And I think we should be fair in assessing that Russian action in Syria, because it's not exactly that we in the West are blameless in our handling of the Middle East, Syria included. Perhaps President Putin knows something that we don't, and he's certainly exploiting skillfully the mistakes that we made as the West in Syria. So I believe Russia should be given its chance to stabilize Syria, but that gives an opportunity to Ukraine to be perhaps less in the focus of President Putin's attention, which might be a very good thing. Thank you very much.
Дякую, Радославе. Колеги, якщо є питання, прошу, представляйтесь.
Should you have any questions, please introduce yourself.
Media Center. I would like to ask you to comment a bit more or to give a forecast on Ukraine-Poland potential relationship with recent change of the government, because what we see at the moment is that Poland is not focusing on Ukraine as much as it used to before the new government. I mean, thank you.
Well, look, in Poland, we've been waiting for you for about 350 years. And we hope that we won't need to wait for another 350 years. I really hope you don't miss this chance of joining our European family of free market democracies, countries where rule of law applies. And I know that every change of government is always a cause for reassessment. And you may or may not know that I didn't vote for this new Polish government. They are political rivals. But I will say this, that on Ukraine, I expect them to be as encouraging to Ukraine as a sort of patron of the nationalist government used to be, namely President Lech Kaczynski, who was, together with your previous president, President Yushchenko, working very hard for the reconciliation about historical matters, and I worked very closely with him, for example, at the Bucharest NATO summit, to try to get the membership action plan for Ukraine. So if law and justice stays to that part, faithful to that part of Lech Kaczynski's legacy, this historic and strategic view of the friendship between Poland and Ukraine, then you should be reassured that Poland's policy will continue. And I'm encouraged by the fact that literally just a couple of days ago, President Duda tweeted in English and I think in Ukrainian on the day of Holodomor, which I know is very important for Ukraine. And I know this because my wife, Anna Applebaum, is just finishing her book on Holodomor, which I believe will be the definitive history, because it's going to be, I think, the first one written in the West actually based on NKVD and Ukrainian archives. I regard myself as someone who knows a thing or two about the history of the Soviet Union, but even I didn't have an idea of the scale of the carnage and of the scale of the genocide that was perpetrated in Ukraine by means of famine. It wasn't a famine, it was genocide by means of famine.
Колеги, чи є ще запитання?
Are there any other questions?
Anna Honcharek, Ukraine Crisis Media Center. As a vocal and very active advocate of Ukraine, who did a lot actually to promote Ukraine's agenda in Europe, do you ever feel disappointed that you invested so much effort and not all the chances that we had were used?
Well, of course I'm disappointed. Look, I organized a series of briefings in Washington in 2004 during the Orange Revolution, and I think they helped to sway the White House to support the revolution. It was, of course, a spontaneous thing in Ukraine, but they were wondering and they were asking for advice, and we organized expert meetings to clarify what was going on, and I think they were helpful. And then we know that that Orange Revolution just led to a rejigging of relationships between oligarchs. That's not what it was supposed to be. And then in the run-up to the Bucharest summit, President Yushchenko and Prime Minister Tymoshenko for months and weeks couldn't agree to write a joint letter to NATO to actually apply for membership action plan. And then my biggest disappointment was President Yanukovych, democratically elected. I came especially to his inauguration, encouraged the EU's High Representative, Lady Ashton, to come to the inauguration. President Lech Kaczynski was also there. I'd met President Yanukovych when he was in opposition. He argued that as Prime Minister he encouraged pro-European policies. And let's also remember that it was under President Yanukovych that we actually negotiated the text of the association agreement, and we closed the text during the Polish presidency of the European Union, which I ran. And there was one element missing. We could have signed the association agreement 18 months before Vilnius, I believe, if President Yanukovych had agreed to some kind of compromise formula over the release of Yulia Tymoshenko. By delaying it, President Yanukovych was responsible for giving time for a reaction to it on the other side of the border. And then, of course, he led us to believe that he will sign the association agreement. I remember several meetings with him, not alone, with Carl Bildt, with Frank-Walter Steinmeier, in which he was passionate in telling us, look, I have the support of all of the former presidents of Ukraine in favor of the association agreement, all the former prime ministers. I've persuaded my party of regions in the East who were skeptical, but I persuaded them that we need this association agreement. And then we convened the European Council in Vilnius, and it was an extraordinary council. All the leaders of Europe came. This didn't happen at the previous meetings of the Eastern Partnership. This time, we helped to persuade Europe that this is really important, and we really need to persuade President Yanukovych to do it. And so literally all of Europe, all the member states, President of the Council, President of the Commission, asked President Yanukovych, look, do you want to sign or don't you? And he decided not to sign, which was, I think, the biggest mistake in his political career. And we know what it led to. So if you ask me if I'm disappointed, yes, I'm hugely disappointed. And don't do it again.
Колеги, чи є ще запитання?
Are there any other questions or clarifications?
Reconciliation process that both of our countries went through already. Do you think we reached point of no return when no reverse process is possible? Because the painful experience in the past is always used by Russian propaganda to instigate some kind of disagreement and conflict. What do you think? Have we reached this point where we cannot be dragged again into these conflicts and discussions and revising this reconciliation?
Look, I think it's irreversible in that sense that we have established the facts of joint history and the faults on both sides. And you can't disinvent that. And that's crucial, because if at least one side lives by myths or by useful lies and doesn't make a reckoning with her own history, then I don't believe reconciliation is possible on the basis of a lie. But just like with the Germans, we established the facts of history, and of course I'm not comparing the two relationships. So two free societies have admitted to what was wrong on each side. But nothing is ever given forever. We have nationalists, we have people who would like to build their self-importance and who misguidedly think that patriotism has to be at the expense of others. And you have such people too. And of course, we know from actually what is going on in Europe, all over Europe right now, that such sentiments are more prominent than they used to be. And I'm actually very worried. And unfortunately, neither Ukraine nor Poland are immune from it.
Так. Віталій Школьний, телевізія RTV.
Виталий Школьный, RTI.
Embargo handlowe do towarów ukraińskich. Polska już ma taki doświad wojen handlowych z Rosją. Czy są jakieś przepisy i co robić w taką sytuacją?
No, zarówno... odpowiedzieć po polsku?
English, please.
English, they want English, all right. Well, look, both Ukraine and Russia are members of the World Trade Organization. 2 years ago, when the first embargo on Ukraine started, even before the Vilnius summit, we were very surprised that Ukraine, under President Yanukovych, did not take the issue to the World Trade Organization. I mean, it takes time, but eventually you might get some kind of justice, and it's a way of highlighting the issue that you think it's unfair and that the other side should stop. But secondly, you have to do what all the other countries that have been affected by Russian embargoes have done. Look at Georgia, look at Moldova, and look at Poland. All these countries had commercial losses initially associated with such an embargo, and all of them, I don't know about the trade balance of Moldova, but certainly Georgia and Poland have diversified their markets and have gained hugely by it. This is a huge opportunity. I think some people in Russia probably thought that if Polish agricultural produce can no longer be exported to Russia, our farmers will rise up in a rebellion and make the Polish government change policy. Actually, we've hardly felt the impact, and Polish agricultural exports have risen last year. So you just have to improve the quality of your produce and search for different markets. And I don't know whether you are talking about agricultural produce or industry, but in general, the amount of food produced in the world and the amount of food that is consumed in the world is pretty constant, because people eat. And therefore, if one country imposes an embargo, what actually happens is that you don't have a cessation of trade, you have a redirection of trade flows. And you just have to be clever about it and find new markets. And then you will find, like we did, look, 25 years ago, the majority of Poland's trade was with the Comecon countries. Today, well over 60% of our trade is with the European Union. And we profit much more from it. Your businessmen just need to get cracking on improving quality and finding new markets.
Місце секунду. Ще уточнення якесь у вас було? Yeah?
You had one more clarification.
A failed state or not?
Ukraine is absolutely not a failed state. I've been to a few failed states in my previous life as a war correspondent. I was in Afghanistan during the Soviet Union's war there, and I know what a failed state looks like. There are no services whatsoever, there is no infrastructure, people are left to themselves, completely helpless, and usually a failed state produces a huge outflow of refugees. Ukraine is a state that's been weakened by systemic corruption, and by the stagnation and lack of reform. Ukraine needs to adjust to a world that is ever faster and ever less forgiving for countries that are not competitive. And today, it's not just businesses that have to be competitive. Today, public sectors have to be competitive in supplying public goods to their citizens. And only when you have both the public and the private sector competitive by world standards do you have a successful society. And Ukraine just has to get its act together. It's easier for you, actually, because you now know what works and what doesn't. 25 years ago, when we were setting off on this course, we were jumping into the unknown. And we made mistakes. Now you can study our example and avoid our mistakes. And as I said, I think your plan is already there. You just need the political will of politicians to be brave, to be persuasive in explaining the reforms, and to just actually do them.
Чи є ще запитання, колега? Дякую дуже.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Дякую.
Колега, наш наступний брифінг за
Our next briefing will take place in 1 minute from now. We have to remember about what has been said by Mr.